in for a big, good treat right now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I usually take a siesta after lunch. Well, not every day, but when I can. But I definitely was had my mind and my eyes opened by Reverend Atik's new interpretations of scriptures, and I learned things I'd never heard before, and I might even try to apply them in some of what I say today. I don't know how well I'll succeed. The first thing I want to say is that I did ask to speak from a podium because I have papers I wanted to lay in front of me, and I wanted to go to that podium because it's a little bit closer to the multitudes. But the microphone wasn't working, so I'm all the way up here. But this is not intentional. The second thing I want to say is really one of the most important, is I want to thank the Episcopal Cathedral of Albuquerque for succumbing to the bullying and the smear tactics and giving in to fear and refusing to host us. It's because of that we're here today at this wonderful Immanuel Presbyterian Church, who have welcomed us. And I believe God might have been speaking through the Episcopal Cathedral of Albuquerque. I also want to thank Friends of Sabeel North America and every individual who was involved in organizing this conference. And I know that you started years ago. I got my first email from Kathy Christensen asking if I'd be available about a year and a half ago, I think. And so I know it's been a tremendous effort. I also want to congratulate Friends of Sabeel for bringing in a good, dear friend of mine, inspiration, Don Wagner, as its national program director. Don, for those of you who don't know him well or don't know him yet, is somebody with I hope he doesn't mind me saying decades, I also have decades at this point, of commitment to the cause of justice in Palestine. And I can think of nobody better than Don to translate the words of the Kairos document into action. He's the right person at the right time, and that may be another way that God is speaking to us, by bringing Don to this place at this time. When I will be hearing Jeff Halper later tonight, when I ran into him coming in, he was holding a copy of my book. Please pick up a copy and copies of all the other books in the book room later. But the point of that is to say, Jeff, I don't know if he's here now, but he said, so much has changed since you wrote this book in 2006. And the book at the time, I said to him, well, at the time I thought it was very daring to talk about a one-state solution. But now when I look at that text, I think, well, I was too timid in many ways. I didn't go as far as I would if I were doing it again. And that is a sign of how things have changed. I think things have also changed since the Kairos document was issued in 2009. And I want to talk more about things that have changed, but before just say a few words about the things that haven't changed, because some of our task is to overcome the things that haven't changed or won't change. Yesterday, of course, we saw speeches at the UN relating to Palestine. Benjamin Netanyahu. I also wanted to bring a cartoon bomb, but I couldn't find the Kinkos in the neighborhood in time. Netanyahu, Mahmoud Abbas, and President Obama, among many others. What struck me was the staleness of all the speeches, how much we had heard the same words we had been hearing for years, words that talk about a peace process, returning to negotiations, a two-state solution. Miko Peled's talk this morning, I think, I couldn't agree more with every word he said. And I suspect that we might be hearing more about this from Jeff as well, that the reality now is a single state, a single entity, but it is one steeped in injustice at every level. And we talk about many of the injustices that we can most visibly see: the settlements, the checkpoints, the theft of land, the physical segregation of people, the discriminatory laws. And all of this we have been talking about and sharing about and anguishing about for many, many years. But there are new levels of injustice that people are barely awaking to in the occupied Palestinian territories, where we see, on top of the injustices of Israeli apartheid and violent colonialism, we see economic neoliberalism. We see businessmen who are doing just fine, thank you, not despite the occupation, but because of the occupation. We see new luxury housing developments going up in the West Bank for the very rich few, and I'm not even talking now about the settlements, while millions of Palestinians remain as refugees with no hope of going home. We see the Palestinian stock market being touted in the New York Times as a great investment, while malnutrition continues to rise among large segments of the Palestinian population, especially children. So all the kinds of injustices of the 1% versus the 99% that we talk about in this country and around the world are being visited on Palestinians on top of everything else. Recently, we had the scandal of the Mitt Romney tapes. And of course, these have been much talked about. But one passage that caught my eye was Mitt's comments about the situation in Palestine, where he basically said, you know, there's no way that we could reach an agreement or a two-state solution. And he said, so what do you do? And Mitt said, you move things along the best way you can. You hope for some degree of stability, but you recognize that this is going to remain an unsolved problem. We live with that in China and Taiwan. All right, we have a potentially volatile situation, but we sort of live with it. And we kick the ball down the field and hope that ultimately, somehow, something will happen and resolve it. We don't go to war to try to resolve it imminently. Now, Mitt Romney got a lot of criticism for those words, but this is one case where I think we should actually thank him for speaking the truth. Because whereas some of the partisan rhetoric was, oh, Mitt Romney, he's going to give up on the peace process before he starts. Well, actually, what Mitt Romney exposed was the current policy of the United States. not just the United States, but the United Nations and the rest of the so-called international community. That while they talk about peace, and while they say our fervent desire is to reach a peaceful settlement as soon as possible, what they're all doing and what they're all complicit in and what they say to each other in private is all we can do is kick the ball down the field and hope that it doesn't blow up in our faces. And it's something that's called conflict management. There's a term for this in political science or whatever else, that, you know, if you can't resolve a problem, you just try to treat the symptoms and hope that it doesn't get worse. And so the rules of conflict management, which are being followed by the Obama administration and will be followed by any successor, is, first of all, doing everything the US can to appease the Israel lobby at home by providing aid to Israel in ever greater amounts. And of course, it's no surprise that the Obama administration truthfully boasts that US aid to Israel is now at unprecedented levels, thanks to its efforts. The same, of course, in the diplomatic field, essentially outsourcing the US veto at the United Nations. Outsourcing now is a big issue in the campaign. So outsourcing the US veto to Israel in the United Nations. Appeasing Israel's warmongering and threats towards Iran by waging an escalating economic and covert war on Iran while never ruling out a military attack. So while I think that the US is not that keen on an attack on Iran on behalf of Israel, especially after Netanyahu's ridiculous speech yesterday, I don't rule it out, because that's where it may come to. The third element of conflict management is maintaining the financial and other support to the Palestinian Authority, which essentially is a puppet regime for the Israeli occupation, and which serves to keep the Palestinian people under control on behalf of Israel. Make sure there's enough aid so things don't get bad enough that they explode. And so all of this, much of this so-called humanitarian aid that is going to the Palestinian Authority is really a subsidy for Israeli occupation. It takes the financial and political burden off Israel so it can continue to colonize and occupy undisturbed. I mentioned already the economic neoliberalism in Palestine that's being called economic peace by Netanyahu, but is very much being implemented by the Palestinian Authority, the World Bank, and the IMF, building exploitive industrial zones in the occupied territories where Palestinians become a cheap labor reserve for Israeli and international firms. Industrial zones often built on land seized from Palestinian farmers by the Palestinian Authority, using similar methods to what Israel uses to take land for settlements. People don't know about this, but it's happening, and it bodes very darkly for the future. Yesterday in the UN, Mahmoud Abbas described the Palestinian people as an angry people, that he came to represent an angry people. And in some sense, that's justified. There is anger, and sometimes we think of anger as a bad thing, and often it is. But it's right sometimes to be angry when there's great injustice, and anger can move us towards action to change the situation. But I think many Palestinians are not so much angry as resigned, hopeless, feeling that there is no way out. So focused on trying to survive that they can't think about politics or struggle. But that's not the whole story. I wanted to talk about the obstacles or the things that won't change or are moving in the wrong direction. But there is so much that is changing that I think we need to focus our attention and energy on. Despite everything that has happened and been done, Palestinians have not surrendered. They still say, after all that has happened, after all the efforts to get them to give up their rights, to abandon the right of return, to recognize Israel as a state that has the right to discriminate against them, Palestinians have held fast to their principles and to their rights. And there's a continuing struggle everywhere, and it's not just in the West Bank and Gaza. Of course, it's in the prisons. Since the beginning of this year, we've seen this amazing movement of Palestinian prisoners going on hunger strike, Palestinian so-called administrative detainees, held for years sometimes without charge or trial by Israel, like Mahmoud Sarsak, the young Palestinian footballer who spent more than 3 years in isolation for no reason, no charges ever leveled against him by Israel, not allowed to see his family. The world didn't hear his name as they heard the name of an Israeli occupation soldier who was taken as a prisoner of war. The world didn't hear the name of Mahmoud Sarsak until he went on a hunger strike for 90 days, coming close to death, forcing Israel to free him. And since the beginning of the year, we've seen prisoner after prisoner use their hunger, use their bodies to resist in a way that, I don't know how many New York Times columnists, how many Tom Friedmans or Nick Kristoffs have told the Palestinians, you ought to have a Palestinian Gandhi. And when these prisoners went on hunger strike for longer than Gandhi ever went on hunger strike, we didn't hear the support from many of those who had been demanding Palestinian Gandhis. But nonetheless, they succeeded in forcing Israel to release them from captivity. But there are still thousands more prisoners. There are so many forms of resistance that are just, legitimate, creative. Reverend Naeem talked about that in the Kairos document, about the duty to resist this evil of occupation and the other injustices that Israel perpetrates against Palestinians. What, for us, I think is relevant here, I mean, the question we all ask ourselves is, what can we do in Albuquerque or Chicago or Berkeley or wherever we've come from? And that's where I think our attention to the BDS movement and our participation in it is so crucial. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. For those who don't know it, this is a movement modeled on the one that was built in solidarity with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And the logic is very simple, that when the power imbalance, earlier today someone asked about how the power balance starts to shift when we heard Miko Peled. Well, the whole point of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is to change the power balance, to say you can't have negotiations between, a military power that is up here and an occupied people that is here. And Palestinians don't have and won't have military power equal to Israel. And nobody wants to see a war between two powers with that much explosive might between them. So Palestinians have to look for other ways to build up their power, to erode that power advantage that Israel has and uses against the Palestinians. And that's the logic of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That if the United States, if the United Nations, if the European Union will not hold Israel accountable, if aid to Israel will reach unprecedented levels, no matter what Israel does, then there has to be an alternative. People have to rise up. People have to take the power into their own hands. And that's what the BDS call says. That's why in 2005, Palestinian civil society issued this call to the world and said, impose boycotts, divest from Israel and companies that profit from its crimes, impose sanctions, just like we did on apartheid South Africa, and we helped to end apartheid. That's what Palestinians are saying. And it's because that message is so clear, so moral, so ethical, so rooted in universal rights, that they have to slander us, the supporters of this injustice, and claim that we are here to slander Jews or engage in anti-Semitism or all the other nonsense that they have never tired of using to try to silence us. It's because the word is getting out that those smears are being used ever more carelessly. I think it's important here to say anti-Semitism is a real thing. And it's the duty of all of us as human beings to stand up to anti-Semitism just as we stand up against any other kind of racism. But when we cry anti-Semitism because people are criticizing these unjust policies, we cover up for real anti-Semites because the charge is devalued. If criticizing Israel's settlements is anti-Semitism, then what isn't? So we have to guard not only against the smears, but maintain our solidarity against real anti-Semitism and racism wherever it is. And this is reflected in the Kairos Palestine call, the call from the Christians of the Holy Land, issued in December 2009, when it says, "We condemn all forms of racism, whether religious or ethnic, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and we call on you, to the churches, we call on you to condemn it and oppose it in all its manifestations. At the same time, we call on you to say a word of truth and to take a position of truth with regard to Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. As we have already said, we see boycott, divestment, and divestment as tools of nonviolence for justice, peace, and security for all." So, say a word of truth through words, but also through actions. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions has done more to bring to the surface the issues that nobody wanted to talk about. What's really happening to Palestinians. So it's another way to say a word of truth. I could stand here for hours, which I won't do, and list to you. I mean, one of the things we hear from some of the pro-Israel groups is they say, oh, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, it's nothing. They have almost no victories. This is going to go nowhere. And I've been hearing that for years. But I could go through for hours some of the victories that have been scored, and I won't. But I will just give you some of the recent ones. When I say recent, I'm talking in the past weeks and months. And I'm just reading these off the electronic intifada, things we've reported on. The global security firm, G4S, one of the biggest in the world, that failed to provide security for the Olympics. A number of major firms and charities in Denmark, it's a Danish-British firm, have ended their ties to G4S in the past few weeks, specifically because of its role in Palestine. One of them is the Danish Merkur Bank decided to terminate its contract with G4S. A spokesperson for the bank told the Electronic Intifada the bank had canceled the contract, quote, because of G4S's involvement in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And there are a number of other organizations there. Just in the past, a few days ago, the Quaker Friends Fiduciary Corporation, which manages $200 million of investments for the Quakers, announced it had divested $390,000 from Hewlett-Packard and Veolia, two companies that profit directly from Israeli occupation. A few months ago, it pulled $900,000 from Caterpillar, which of course makes many of the bulldozers Israel uses to demolish homes and kill people. In July, the BDS movement, the Boycott National Committee in Palestine, spoke about this is 7 years, the 7th anniversary since the 2005 BDS call, and some of the milestones that have been achieved by this movement. I'll just give you a few of them. Agrexco, Israel's former largest exporter of agricultural produce, entered liquidation because in 2011, following a campaign of blockades, demonstrations, lobbying of supermarkets and governments, and popular boycotts in more than 13 countries across Europe. The largest cooperative in Europe, the Co-op supermarkets in the UK, introduced a policy to end trade with companies that source products from Israel's illegal settlements following a determined campaign by Co-op members. And for those who don't know, the Co-op, it really is a huge national chain in the UK. It's like, you know, Safeway, or I don't know what the regional chains are here, but it would be like Jewel Osco in Chicago. A sustained campaign against Ahava, the Israeli cosmetics company situated in a settlement, forced the company to close its flagship London store, and retailers in the UK, Norway, Japan, and Canada have announced boycotts of the company. Setting a worldwide precedent for the academic boycott of Israel, the University of Johannesburg severed ties with Israel's Ben Gurion University following a campaign backed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and hundreds of South African academics. Academic unions in the UK, Canada, and even the United States have voted to support various academic boycott campaigns and initiatives. And there are also campaigns now as far afield as South Africa, Ireland, Chile, Brazil, Pakistan, India, and in many European countries. Scores of artists, especially musicians and filmmakers, have refused to perform in Israel or canceled scheduled performances following pressure from activists, and these include Bono, Snoop Dogg, Jean-Luc Godard, Elvis Costello, Gil Scott-Heron, and many others. Alice Walker, Naomi Klein, Roger Waters, Judith Butler, Ken Loach, Arundhati Roy, Angela Davis, and many others have spoken publicly of their support for the BDS movement. So there are many other examples I could give you. That's just a taste. Now, all of a sudden, you know, all these little victories, which are so easily dismissed individually, start to add up to something. They start to add up to a global wave, a global movement. And Israel is feeling the pressure. And you can tell because it's putting its money where its mouth is. Millions of dollars are being allocated for initiatives to try to fight Palestine solidarity activism and to fight the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Here in Albuquerque, the Jewish Federation of New Mexico, which I certainly know does not speak for all Jews in New Mexico, because many Jewish people have been at the forefront of speaking for justice in Palestine. But the Jewish Federation of New Mexico is part of a national initiative called the Israel Action Network that has been going around smearing conferences like this, trying to paint this movement for justice as something sinister and dark and threatening. Recently, we've had a lot of debate about free speech. Apparently, anything, if it attacks or denigrates Muslims, has to be defended in the name of free speech. No matter the damage it does, not just to Muslims, but to all of us as human beings. But when it comes to criticism of Israel, the same standards don't seem to apply. So, amazingly, a few weeks ago, the California House of Representatives passed a resolution, Resolution 35, that basically declared that criticism of Israel amounts to anti-Semitism. And even more than that, it urged the University of California and other schools to crack down on activities that criticize Israel. It's unbelievable. You'd think, how could this be happening in the United States? But you can go and read House Resolution 35. But what's inspiring has been the pushback to this. And just one example of that, the University of California Student Association, a body which represents hundreds of thousands of students across the University of California system, passed a resolution 2 weeks ago condemning HR 35 unanimously. And some of the students who were involved in that said that what's so amazing and so different from just 2 years ago is that it was uncontroversial. It passed by 12-0. Just 2 years ago, at the University of California, Berkeley, there was a huge battle over divestment. And you might remember what happened. The student Senate passed the divestment initiative by a significant margin, but then it was vetoed by the Senate president. And the question of overturning the veto became a huge national debate. The Israeli government brought people in, the Israeli consul general sent people, and so on. And the veto was upheld narrowly. But it was a huge controversy. And what the students in California are saying now is that in 2 years, things have changed. It's taken for granted that we stand for Palestinian rights, and we stand against efforts to silence people speaking out. We've seen, and I won't say much about it in the interest of time, but really there is a concerted national attack on freedom of speech in the universities. And I've written about this, and my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman has reported on it extensively in the Electronic Intifada, so I would refer you there for more information. But the key effort that has been underway is to take the 1965 Civil Rights Act, Title VI, and use it as a weapon to silence speech in support of Palestinian rights on campuses. And here's how it works. In 2010, the Obama administration issued a letter reinterpreting the way it applies Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Title VI imposes on educational institutions a responsibility to make sure they are free from any atmosphere of harassment or intimidation for students based on their race or ethnicity. And in 2010, the Obama administration expanded its interpretation to include religion. Now, this is not a bad thing, this is a good thing, because we see people being victimized on the basis of their religion, and they should enjoy the protections of the law. But what pro-Israel groups have done is to say that any university that allows BDS activism or divestment campaigns to run unchecked is allowing an atmosphere that intimidates Jewish students and creates an atmosphere of fear for Jewish students. And what we've seen is a flurry of complaints to the US Department of Education under Title VI from various colleges claiming that there is an atmosphere of intimidation for Jewish students. This has happened at UC Berkeley, at UC Santa Barbara, at Columbia University. And this is so spurious, of course, because the underlying logic, I would say, I've argued in something I've written, that the claim of these pro-Israel groups is anti-Semitic. Because it assumes that every person who is Jewish is automatically offended by criticism of Israel. It makes an assumption about people's views on Israel based on their religion or their identification, when the reality is that many Jewish students, along with Palestinian students and students of every background, have been in the forefront of these campaigns for justice on campuses all across the country. But I raise it to say that these kinds of tactics are tactics that have conceded, and those who had the chance to hear Sidney Levy's great workshop presentation today talked about how pro-Israel groups are conceding certain arguments from the outset. They don't try to defend the occupation. They don't try to defend the settlements anymore. They know that cause is lost. So they try to shift the discussion somewhere else. And so I think that these sorts of bully tactics and intimidation tactics are a concession that there is no answer other than justice. That the only answer to the claims we are making is to do justice. And those who are not ready to do justice or not ready to support justice want to try and silence and stifle the debate. So those of us who engage in this kind of work are going to face these things. Many of us have for many years, and we're still here. And they should not intimidate you from taking up the charge in the Kairos document and in the BDS call. And know that when you are fighting a great injustice, of course you're going to meet resistance. And that resistance is part of the process, and not to be intimidated or dissuaded by it. And it brings me to close to the end of what I want to say, brings me to the divestment efforts in the churches, because we've seen so much activity in the past couple of years, and I know that some of the people in this room have been very involved in that and have done amazing, amazing work. And some of it has borne fruit with the decisions we've seen from for example, the Methodists and the UCC and the Presbyterians to support a boycott of settlement goods. But there were disappointments, as when the Presbyterians, where so much effort had been put in, very narrowly defeated the divestment call. But what was interesting to me was, and it was, I don't know if God was speaking through the fact that 666 votes were cast in the Presbyterian General Assembly. I know I should be careful here. And the vote for divestment, that was a joke. The vote for divestment failed by 2, just 2. But what was telling was that the committee, the Presbyterian committee that had studied this issue for years and made its recommendation, was unanimous in its recommendation that we must divest. They were very clear. What was also interesting was that, you know, this is no offense to those who were pushing for divestment. You know, they're a motley crew. They're just a few people. They're not working with great support behind them or huge financial resources. But on the other side, you had the Israel Action Network pouring in immense resources to try to prevent the vote from passing. And so it was telling us there was no celebrations. I didn't see any triumphalism among the pro-Israel groups because they knew it was that close, and I believe that in 2014 it's going to pass. I remember on the night of the Presbyterian vote, I know a lot of people felt great disappointment, and there was a sense of a letdown. There was so much hope that it would pass. And I was reminded of something I came across in my research. I mean, we all like to think now that everybody was against apartheid in South Africa, right? The churches were just treading over each other to divest, right? Isn't that right? Isn't that what we all think? Who could be for the great evil of apartheid in South Africa? Weren't we all against it? Well, here was an Associated Press report I came across from 12th of July, 1987. Headline: Church of England rejects divestment from South Africa. Quote, leaders of the Church of England rejected a proposal Saturday to get rid of the church's investments in South Africa, despite pleas by some churchmen that the holdings are morally wrong. The 570-member General Synod of Bishops, Clergy and Laity of England State Church voted by a show of hands to accept the annual financial report without the proposed divestment amendment. In other words, it wasn't even close like the Presbyterian vote. Sir Douglas Lovelock, who as first Church Estates Commissioner controls $3.2 billion in real estate and stock, said, the Church's investments in South Africa were indirect, consisting of investments in multinational companies, doing a fraction of their business in that country. Companies like Hewlett-Packard and Veolia in Palestine, or Caterpillar, for example. For an institution of our size, I want to say this, the response from the Reverend Alan Webster, Dean of St. Paul's: we need to send a clear signal to the suffering people of South Africa living under the bitter injustice of apartheid that we are on their side. I appeal to the commissioners for rather wider consultations. They do not realize how troubled people are by investments in an apartheid-dominated country. So can you imagine? In 1987, that was the state of the debate. Who remembers that? Weren't we all stamping out of the door in support of divestment from South Africa? Even something that in hindsight seems so obvious, to divest from a regime as evil as apartheid South Africa was not at the time. The battle had to be fought and the battle had to be won. And I will end with this. I think that one day the good people at the Episcopal Cathedral might look back on their decision these past few months with some embarrassment and shame. Thank you.
The floor is now open for questions. If you would like to ask Ali a question, anybody have a comment? Thank you, sir.
I would just like to make the announcement that there are people at this conference, I don't know their name, but I read them, who canceled their contributions and pledge to the Episcopal Cathedral because of the action it took.
I'm definitely not calling for a boycott of the Episcopal Cathedral. I don't want anyone to get that impression. But people follow their consciences.
Sir.
This is a misunderstanding that some people have been putting about. There is no change, in fact, that both statements exist and have always existed. And I think that the reason for the original wording that excluded 1967 was simply an oversight that was later added. But there's been no recent change. That's that's false, that I've seen people putting it around online. The issue is that the three pillars of the BDS call deal with all of historic Palestine anyway. That's not a controversial issue. So the end of occupation of all Arab lands refers to the military occupation of 1967. But that doesn't mean in any way that the BDS call shies away from the 1948 areas from Israel pre-1967. It's very clear that's the second pillar of the BDS call. And of course, the third one deals with the rights of refugees. So when you're ending, as I don't remember the exact wording, but ending all forms of discrimination and racism and against Palestinians in Israel, that is ending colonization, because it is a colonial relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. And I think of justice as being decolonization of the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. As you had to decolonize, and it's an ongoing process, the relationship between white South Africans and the rest, so that they become not settler and native, but citizens in a state or an entity where everyone has rights and there is restitution for those who've been wronged. So there is no change and there is no significance to that difference in wording.
Another question for Mr. Abunimah. Sir.
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, you know, if BDS is so insignificant, why does Israel need to pass laws making it illegal for its citizens to publicly support it? And they did pass such a law either late last year or early this year, making, you know, so that if an Israeli or someone, in fact anyone, I think they're claiming global jurisdiction for this. Israel has no borders, so I mean, you know. But that if somebody advocates for boycott of X company because of its activities, say Ahava, then, the owners of Ahava can sue them for any losses or any damages. That's one of the provisions of the law. But, we saw this in, a lot of people like to say, I hear it a lot, oh, Israel is a democracy within a certain area, a democracy that rules over millions of people with no basic rights. I mean, that's like saying South Africa was a democracy for white people. And in many ways, South Africa was liberal with respect to its white citizens, or the only people it saw as citizens. But what you saw towards the end of apartheid was actually the kind of repression that had been used for decades against black South Africans start to be used more vigorously and openly against white South Africans who were starting to break with the regime. And you could draw some parallel there, that Israel is having to use more and more repressive measures, even against Jewish people, to begin to silence this kind of solidarity.
And
I'll just say, because there are people in Israel who support, there's groups like Boycott from Within, where you have Israelis and Israeli Jews who are calling for boycott of Israel. And also, there are some Israelis who would not support boycott of Israel, but who support boycott of the settlements. And even they, are facing, these kinds of legal threats.
last question, thank you.
I'm aware of, I have it in here somewhere, but I don't know if I'll be able to find it right now, that Israeli artists and performers who receive government funding are required to agree to participate in activities aimed at promoting Israel. Is that what you're referring to? Not all Israeli artists, but those who accept government funding. But we've seen, for example, the Bat Sheva dance company going around the US and Europe, and it's being protested and boycotted, and you get people who say, well, dance, it's so beautiful, dance should bring us together, and we shouldn't boycott dance, and that sort of thing. And that sounds very nice on its surface, but the thing to remember is the Bat Sheva dance company and other things like that are sponsored directly by the Israeli government as part of its propaganda efforts. And there is a department within the foreign ministry whose stated goal is to use these cultural types of activities to whitewash Israel's image. What they want is people to think of ballet instead of children being killed by white phosphorus in Gaza. So the point of boycotting Israeli government-sponsored dance and whatever else is to say, we will not allow you to change the subject. We will not allow the Israeli government to propagandize people this way. So that's really where the cultural boycott comes in terms of artists coming here.
Please help me thank Ali, and then a couple of announcements.